They were the elite of the elite, soldiers the world whispered about, but never fully understood. Green Berets who had been forged in the most merciless crucibles of training the kind that crushed 90% of those who dared enter and left the survivors hardened. Unbreakable, men who had stared death in the face in the jungles of Vietnam and smiled. Yet in January of 1970, in a moment that defied everything they had ever known, every single one of them fled not from bullets, not from ambushes, not from the Viet Cong who had haunted the jungles for decades, ran from the Americans' own allies, from the Australians, from a place called Nui Dat before they even saw the wire, before they glimpsed the silent figures moving through the rubber plantation. They smelled it, a stench that clawed at their senses. Primal, human yet alien, a smell that spoke of something deeper than warfare, something older than combat, a smell that made the hairs on their necks stand on end and their stomachs knot in fear. Was not rot, not decay, not gunpowder, not the fetid sweat of a battle-weary jungle. It was something else entirely. Something deliberate, purposeful. A presence made tangible through the air itself. The Pentagon would classify what followed for decades, not because it did not happen, but because it was too real, too effective, too dangerous to acknowledge. The Australians had arrived quietly in 1966. Small reconnaissance teams, observers, trackers. By 1970, they had become predators. Men who did not fight like soldiers, but moved like hunters. Men who understood fear as a tool, as a weapon, as the ultimate leverage. Pentagon analysts later struggled to describe their methods, using the word predators, a term that exists in doctrine only as a metaphor. But here it applied literally, a five-man patrol, achieving results that an American company of 150 could not. Regions rendered silent, not by bombs, but by the knowledge that the Hmong were near. The enemy learned quickly. They feared what could not be seen. They feared what could not be predicted. They feared the shadows that moved with intent. The Americans were sent to observe, to understand, to integrate. Green Berets, men who had seen it all, who had survived impossible trials, who had stared death in the face without flinching. They stepped into a war that was not theirs to comprehend. The briefing alone unsettled them. No maps with satellite overlays, no objective points, no extraction windows. The Australian patrol leader spoke in terms that belonged to another age. Territory, patterns, prey, habits. Fear, not enemy numbers, not firepower, not logistics. The Americans glanced at one another, unease crawling under their skin. They were trained for combat. They were not trained for this. They departed Nui Dat before dawn. Moonless night, absolute silence. The jungle itself seeming to hold its breath. Within minutes the Australians were signaling them to slow, to quiet, to move differently. These were Green Berets, masters of jungle stealth. Yet beside the Australians, they were clumsy, loud, intrusive. By the second hour, the Americans began to realize the truth. The Australians were not moving through the jungle. They were merging with it, their bodies, postures, breathing. Even their footsteps became part of the terrain. They flowed like water through the undergrowth. Inhuman yet natural. Rations were cold, odorless, engineered to leave no trace. No smoke, no fires, no noise, no scent. Silence was their weapon. Patience their ally. 3 days passed in this tense, nerve-shredding silence. Then came the fourth day, and the jungle froze. Enemy close. The Australians disappeared. Men who were there a second ago were gone. The Americans could not track them. They felt exposed, vulnerable, aware of every sound of their own bodies. 12 Viet Cong soldiers walked past veterans, armed, alert. The Americans expected an ambush, expected gunfire, explosions. Chaos. None came. The Australians allowed the enemy to move freely. Then followed, hour by hour, inch by inch, every leaf, every broken branch, Every subtle movement noted, the Americans could hear the Viet Cong speaking in whispers. Unaware of the hunters in their midnight, fell. The enemy set camp, relaxed, trusting the jungle. Trusting that the unseen would not strike. They were wrong. By dawn, 7 men were gone. No shots fired, no explosions, the work of hands, knives. Pressure applied with precise cruelty. Survivors fled screaming, their terror echoing through the trees, through the villages. Through the very air, the legend of the Hmong began to spread. And yet, it was what the Australians did next that broke the Americans. The patrol moved through the camp deliberately, methodically, arranging bodies, removing items, leaving signs, symbols, messages, not for intelligence, not for tactical gain, for terror, for psychological dominance. For the invisible conquest of the mind. One Green Beret vomited, another sat frozen. The patrol leader did not hesitate, did not apologize. This was routine, this was doctrine. Back at Nui Dat, the Americans said nothing. Their reports were empty. Hollow. Within 72 hours, every single Green Beret requested transfer. Official reason: cultural incompatibility. Reality: something darker. Something that could not be written down. These Australians were not cruel. They were hunters. Predators, precise, efficient. Deadly. Many had grown up in the outback, tracking kangaroos across endless wilderness. Aboriginal soldiers carried ancient knowledge of land and silence. Teams rotated together, not as individuals. Trust, absolute understanding, telepathic. Communicating without words. Weeks. Without resupply, no artillery, no air support. If they called for help, they had already failed. Enemy units believed the jungle itself was hunting them. Australians understood what Americans never could. Fear spreads faster than bullets. It lingers longer than wounds. It changes behavior. Entire regions became dead zones. Not destroyed, silenced, and yet the cost was enormous. Living as hunters reshaped them. Returning home was a different battle. Trauma. Silent but deep. Living with the work done with their own hands. The Americans studied the results and buried them because some methods win wars but cannot exist in polite doctrine, because some victories are too effective for bureaucracies to tolerate. The Green Berets did not flee danger. They fled a realization. They saw a path they could not walk, a method too pure, too ruthless, too effective. They saw what victory looked like without restraint. The smell that met them that night was not just death, it was calculation, intention, psychological mastery, a presence that announced the hunters. Before they were seen, that smell lingered in memory, in silence, in classified files, a reminder that the most terrifying thing in war is sometimes not the enemy, but an ally who has crossed lines you cannot. This story begins with a smell and ends with retreat, not from weakness, but from truth. The Australians left Vietnam in 1971. The war continued, the methods remained, the impact lasted for decades. Green Berets who fled did not fail. They recognized a truth too dangerous to live with, a truth about effectiveness unconstrained, about fear weaponized, about hunters who became more than soldiers. And that, perhaps, is the most honest story of Nui Dat, that some victories cannot be tolerated, that some truths are easier to flee than to face, and that sometimes the battlefield is not the jungle, not the enemy, but the shadow of an ally moving unseen.